Thank you so much, everyone, for making this festival such a great success. A big round of applause for all our volunteers, supporters, and well-wishers. And hopefully we're going to come in a bigger way in 2015, February 2015. Before that, I would like to call Shazia Sikandar to the stage to accept the LLF Lifetime Achievement Award. Shazia. I would now like to request the US Ambassador to Pakistan, Richard Olson, to come and say a few words about the Lahore Literary Festival and the cultural sponsorship that the US Embassy has undertaken over the years in Pakistan. Ambassador? Thank you.
Thank you, Razi, and let me add my congratulations to the organizers and the participants in the Lahore Literary Festival. It's a great honor to be with you this afternoon. I can feel a tremendous amount of energy in the hall. We certainly applaud the promotion of social and intellectual discourse, and for that reason, the U.S. government, through our Consulate General in Lahore, has been proud to be a sponsor, among the sponsors of the Lahore Literary Festival. And the reason is because we are not neutral on the question of cultural preservation or indeed the topic of this afternoon's session, War on Culture. We believe in the preservation of culture in the face of the challenges of war and extremism. And I'd like to give you a few examples of the way that the U.S. government is involved in Pakistan and more broadly in questions of cultural preservation. First, on a more basic level, on the question of literacy, which provides the basis for, obviously, a literary festival and indeed for social and intellectual discourse. We recently launched a $190 million program to promote a culture of reading in Pakistan. This was launched about a week and a half ago. The aim of the program is to foster reading amongst children and to enhance the teaching of teachers, the training of teachers to a higher level of proficiency so that they can expand literacy in Pakistan. Some of the indicators, frankly, in Pakistan have been discouraging, but we think there's a substantial way forward. The second topic that I'd like to just briefly touch on is the preservation of cultural heritage sites. The U.S. State Department has a program called the Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation. It funds projects around the world, 650 projects in 120 countries, and 17 of those are in Pakistan. And served in both Iraq and in Afghanistan, that obviously our record is not unmixed in these areas. But I do think that we have learned during the course of this decade, and we have made some significant efforts to work in the field of cultural preservation. My reference point here perhaps is George Clooney's recent movie, Monument Men. It's not widely recognized, but actually, first of all, many of the people who did it were actually women, not men. And in addition, many of the people who did cultural preservation after the Second World War worked for the State Department, not just for the U.S. military. But the State Department has an image problem, perhaps like Pakistan, with Hollywood. But we have carried on this tradition over the last decade. We actually have staff archaeologists assigned to our embassies in Kabul and our embassy in Baghdad. I had the privilege last year of visiting Mas Ainak, the great center of Gandhara Buddhism, where the U.S. government is working to preserve and record an architectural and an archaeological treasure that will probably not exist in future because of commercial development of the underlying copper mine, not by a U.S. firm, I might add. But we are very proud of the work that we have done in this and a number of other areas, including the restoration of the Herat Citadel in Afghanistan. With that, let me turn to this afternoon's panel. And my job is to introduce someone who I think is probably quite well known to the audience, Ms. Mishal Husain. She's, of course, a reporter with extensive experience around the world, including in Cairo during the Arab Spring, and she was also the BBC's first Washington, D.C.-based anchor. So, with that, over to you, Mishal. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you very much, and it's fantastic to hear about the work that the US government is making possible in Pakistan, and particularly in Lahore, and I know you mentioned work elsewhere in other countries, in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. So important for the subject of our session today, which is the war on culture. And I'd like to say that as someone who's reported frequently from Pakistan on some really tough subjects, it is so fantastic to be in a setting like this, in one of the most cultured cities in the world, but also amidst such a gathering of people. It's a meeting of minds, and I think everything that Razi and his team have made possible in the last few days has been really fantastic. And it's been wonderful to be here to see it and to be a part of it today. So well done to everyone who's made it possible. But our subject in this discussion is the destruction, sadly, of culture, which is a reality in so many different places, which is why we've termed it the war on culture. There are so many examples, and I know this term, war on culture, will mean something different to probably everyone in this room. But let me just give you a couple of examples. The Taliban and what happened to the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001. More recently, the Taliban threat to Gandhara art and artifacts in Swat. And across the border from here in India, the outcry over some of M.F. Husain's paintings, which ultimately contributed to his exile from India, and most recently the row over Wendy Doniger's book on Hinduism that's ended up being pulped by Penguin in India. Now that is clearly a scholarly work rather than an artistic creation or a cultural artifact, but I think it ties in with our subject here because there is increasing evidence of our cultural lives and our heritage being under attack from extremists. So I'm going to introduce the panel to you now. You'll all know Ahmed Rashid well for his work on Pakistan and Afghanistan. And Ahmed has also been one of the people behind the Lahore Literary Festival, so thank you for that. Hugh Eakin from the New York Review of Books has written extensively about the destruction of culture in Iraq and Syria, but also on other subjects that are relevant to our discussion here. Naman Ahuja is a leading art historian from Jawaharlal Nehru University and also a renowned expert on Gandharan art, and also the writer Vikram Seth, I'm sure, is well known to all of you. So I've said what war on culture means to me, so I'm going to ask each member of the panel really what comes to their mind when we use this evocative term, war on culture. Ahmed, let's start with you. What does the term mean to you?
Well, to me, as you said, it means many things, but above all, it means to me, the degradation of human rights now that we are facing in our own lifetime. When we were children, we did not see these levels of abuses against women, against minorities, against children, children being hired to fight in armies, suicide bombing, the whole degradation of human rights, and ultimately the failure of governments and organizations to actually educate the public about defending human rights. I think this is really degrading our culture enormously, because as Muslims, as Pakistanis, as human beings, as citizens of the world, we deserve better than this. And this, this has happened literally within the blink of an eye. within just the last few years of, and things are just going backwards, not forwards.
So for you, it's very broad then. The degradation of culture is really, in your view, the degradation of society then?
Well, yes. I mean, if you can treat human beings by slitting their throats and raping women and abusing children, if you can treat human beings like that, of course, destroying artifacts and paintings and censorship and all is much easier to do. If you're prepared to go to this extent in undermining human values that we have known for centuries, then destroying the real monuments of art and culture becomes very easy.
Hugh, what does the term mean to you?
Well, to follow from Ahmed's very good point, I focus very much on the physical destruction of culture, but I think they're intensely linked. The destruction of the society and the destruction of the sort of physical manifestations of culture. And just take what's happened in the last few years in the Middle East. And a few weeks ago, the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo was truck bombed. And this is only the latest in a series of destructive acts on cultural institutions by different forces in society. Syria is such a terrible situation that one feels defensive to talk about culture because the humanitarian situation is so appalling, and yet culture is at the core of this. And I just want to give some examples. I think there are 6 World Heritage Sites in Syria, and all of them have been damaged over the course of the last few years. Deliberately damaged, or damaged just because they're in the midst of a war zone? Every permutation. The Crac des Chevaliers, the Crusader fort, was in an air raid last summer. It's unclear whether it was targeted. There is an Umayyad mosque. There was in Aleppo one of the most aesthetically extraordinary minarets in the entire region was destroyed, and it's unclear whether by opposition forces or by the government. It was caught in gunfire. There are just countless examples. And to connect this to Ahmed's point, there are these series of archaeological sites in northern Syria called the Dead Cities, ancient inhabitations that are essentially a series of archaeological sites spread out over a large area between Aleppo and Idlib, near the border with Turkey. And this also happens to be the area where millions of Syrians have been uprooted from their homes. Many of them had fled across the border, but many couldn't get across the border, and the archaeological sites themselves have become erzatz, inhabitations for refugees. And so there's this destruction of the sites taking place even as they're providing a kind of refuge for this destroyed culture.
I know you've looked at Iraq as well, and perhaps we'll come back to that in a moment. Naman Ahuja.
I think each of us in our lives lives just about a hair's breadth away from being censored, from having our creative impulses and our imaginations proscribed, fenced, and limited. And the question really is, how are we fighting for our right to express ourselves? How can we fight this war that we face in our daily lives? It's not some other, and it's not some separate. The monuments that we are losing are ours. And why is there so much apathy? It's one thing for all of us in the Jaipur Lit Fest. I mean, it's like preaching to the converted here. But what are you going to do when you go outside this auditorium to be able to instill in anyone else that you meet, to be able to maintain that, to fight that war against culture? The job is not for us to sit and talk about it here, but to be able to see how much we can make that policy a practical way of our lives, to be able to spread a message, to be able to protect culture and spaces for culture. How much can we fight to have these lit fests, to have cultural exchanges, to have more galleries that have the gumption and the strength to be able to show the kind of art that we want to showcase, to be able to publish the books that we want to read? Because each of us are crying out for a greater amount of literacy and education and to be able to see that stuff, but really how much protection do we have to be able to provide that? And I think that's the larger question that I want to try and address, is what we can do to practically protect the space for culture.
And do you feel that the war against the destruction of culture, if I can put it that way, that is fought by the elite rather than the grassroots? I mean, you'd like to see more of a demand for preservation.
Yes, I think it's contingent on all of us to have certain responsibilities. I mean, we have certain responsibilities and we have to uphold them. We have to go out there and do something to protect our space. Because if you're not doing anything about it and sitting and watching upon the destruction of culture, you're complicit in the act.
Thank you. Vikram, some very well-documented cases of not just destruction of culture, but really battle against freedom of expression in India.
Well, yes. I mean, I certainly take both the particular points of the destruction of bricks and mortar and stone, statuary, and so on. To some extent, we can say in our age it's more difficult to destroy books in the sense that you can pulp them, which is an act of, to me as a writer, desecration. But because of the nature of sort of the E-world, the I-world, and so on, it may be more difficult than, for example, it was for the first Chinese Qin emperor to destroy all the books except those on law and agronomy and so on. And the Analects of Confucius only survived in the walls of buildings and had to be dug out 60 years later and revived. But culture, as Ahmed said, is not just that. It's also a way of being. It's how we treat each other. And whether it's the destruction of the marshes of Iraq, and with them not just the destruction of the way of life of people, but you could say culture in a sense is that as well. Now, Mishal referred to India and events that have happened recently. Two events have happened recently, and they've both been associated to some extent with the courts. The first is this book, the Penguins Compromise, let's say, or coming to terms with this organization, the Shiksha Bachao Andolan, which is an organization that has been at the back of a lot of suppression of books, scholarship, and so on. This is not the first case. There was a case where a scholarly book on Shivaji, for example, was instituted by them. And in that case, a mob went into the library where one of the people, the author had researched. He'd simply acknowledged that library, and they went in and they virtually destroyed it. So this happened some years ago. There perhaps was not quite such a furore about it as there has been with this. In this case, it was at the district court level. One wonders why, in fact, Penguin did this. I don't think they expected the effect upon authors, the effect upon the public at large, the chill that went through the hearts of people in any medium.
Because essentially they did something preemptive. I mean, they didn't wait to get, they said that they needed to guard their offices, their staff against attack, and therefore they took this preemptive action by pulping it.
It's very difficult. I've tried to speak to various people, because after all, I am partly a Penguin author still.
I was going to ask you, they are your publishers.
Let me take an example. Would, for example, the fact that An Equal Music has scenes of adultery, which is against Indian culture. Of course it's not, but I mean, it can be in parentheses put as being against Indian culture. Or the Golden Gate has homosexuality, which is against Indian culture. Of course it's not, it never has been. Homophobia came in 1861, not homosexuality. Or what if during In a Suitable Boy I talk about the RSS being an intolerant organization? Will Penguin, or would Macmillan, or would any of these large firms protect me? How can one assume that this would happen. So that's the first case I gave. But I'm rather hogging the mic, so I'll come to the second case later.
Okay. Well, I just wonder then, Naman, do you think Penguin India, did it do the wrong thing then by acting the way it did? Or did it have a duty to its staff and to people involved with the production of the book?
To the entire publishing industry and to its authors and to the reading public, to all three. I think when you are such a big publishing firm, you have a responsibility to your readers and to your authors. And this is not a responsibility that a publisher must take lightly.
Absolutely, and they have deep pockets. They're not going to be bankrupted by this. And this was at the district court level. It had gone on for years. It could have continued for another 4 or 5 years.
And this is a book that was published 5 years ago.
Indeed.
But you see, it sets a very dangerous precedent, does it not? That to any other campaign group which could decide today, actually, that a book, book of yours, which was published some time ago, that some passage in it is not, it raises really frightening prospects about what it could lead to, Ahmed.
Yes, it does. The point is, if governments and societies are going to back down in favor of a small group of extremists, then that society is going to come to an end, and it's going to cease to function in the way that modernization does work, and that's why this extremism is so destructive. I've seen in my lifetime the wars in Afghanistan and the emergence of the Taliban. Now, the Taliban emerged out of the total destruction of a country and the deaths of millions of people, the destruction of everything. Culture almost becomes irrelevant. But then they adopt such a code of behavior that is almost anti-human. And so, unfortunately, what has happened in India, I'm not saying it's going to lead to, the end of Indian society or anything like that, but it's a terrible blow to society in general, and to, of course, as the imagination, to writing, to the arts, to everything that we know, which is part of society.
It's interesting, though, and depressing at the same time, though, Hugh, that if you note that there are so many common examples that we could pick out in so many different countries, which shows that the destruction of culture is not unique to any particular movement or any extremist group. You were talking about how the destruction in Syria is happening because of both sides.
On both sides, absolutely. And I think, though, that what you can identify is that at a core level that there is if we start with the idea that culture has inherent qualities such as cosmopolitanism, that there is an essential need for a plural view of the world, and that it's the narrowing of the cultural space. It's in those situations that we have these acts of destruction. And in Syria, it's no accident. This has happened hand in hand with the destruction of a society which was had many problems, very authoritarian, but at the societal level before the conflict, it was a very mixed society, and you had minorities, many minorities. It was a refuge, ironically, for refugees from many other parts of the Middle East. 1 million Iraqis went to Syria during the Iraq War. Hundreds of thousands of Lebanese have taken refuge in Syria. Going back to the end of the Ottoman Empire, you had many Armenians fleeing to Turkey. There was a very rich Armenian community in Aleppo. This community was destroyed along with the old market of Aleppo. These are the elements that lead to this kind of destruction, I think, is when you start to destroy this broad cosmopolitan base of culture.
I want to ask you all why you think we are seeing this trend. Is it nihilism? Is it just an idea that a void is better than anything creative, or is there actually a philosophy of some kind behind it? Naman, what do you think?
I think it's because of being extremely fragile in yourself and catering to the lowest common denominator in thought for your vote bank that seems to think it irrelevant to be able to adjudicate on anything beyond what's going to lead to mass mobilization. And those instruments which are going to allegedly get government the greatest amounts of votes are the only things that they will find time to be able to talk about in parliaments. And that's where it all goes into a vicious circle. Because for those of us who want to try and break that circle, we'll never get the time of day to be able to break that circle because it's not important enough. You've got Supreme Courts that are dealing with death penalties and death sentences and genocides and vote bank politics that they have to pander to. They're not going to be able to enshrine and live up to their demands for the protection of minority rights.
It's easy, isn't it? It's easier to destroy than it is to create or preserve.
Absolutely.
Vikram?
Well, I don't think it's only the politicians who are involved with this. But I think that I agree with you about the fragility of one's sense of self. But it's not just the politicians. I think also there are religious figures and ideological figures involved as well. But let's concentrate on the religious. It's because I think people are terribly afraid of losing their control, their power, and their flock. So what they see is happening in the world, and perhaps taking the liberty of reading someone else's mind, is they feel that it seems that the world is becoming more understanding of each other. There are people sitting, Americans and Indians and Pakistanis sitting together, understanding each other, people of different religions. And those who are sort of extreme, believers in one form, one religion or another, or even one subsection of a religion, feel that they are losing control of their flock. And I think the increased intolerance that we've seen, not just in our part of the world, but really even in Europe, for example, in the old Yugoslavia and other parts as well, is because people feel if we don't get it under control, we will be sidelined. Now, these two processes are happening at the same time. That is, people making friends across borders, reading things that people of other countries have written, understanding other people's points of view. There's a certain speed with which that's happening. And there's also the speed with which people are now desperately trying to set someone off against another for, as Naman said, political advantage or for advantage in terms of power. Now the real question is, at what rate are these two things happening? And which is going to defeat the other? And behind all this lies the third rate, which is the rate of technological advance, because it's going to become increasingly easy to blow things up. I mean, something 3 times the size of that water bottle in front of me will probably, in 10 years' time or 15 years' time, be large enough to blow up Delhi or Lahore or London. So what happens between our 2 ears is largely based on those 2 rates, the first 2. And the result of it can be disastrously realized by the third.
Ahmed, thinking back to Bamiyan, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that as being the real watershed moment, I guess, where one really saw what the Taliban were capable of, what militancy was capable of in terms of attacking culture. Were there things that happened before that that were just under the radar in comparison? And why do you think that happened and is continuing to happen?
Well, the destruction of the Bamiyan statues, to be honest, was the inspiration of Al-Qaeda. And it was a pressure of Al-Qaeda on the Taliban to do it. And a section of the Taliban then agreed with Al-Qaeda and they went and did it. But before that, of course, there was the destruction of the Kabul Museum, which held some of the greatest artifacts of Central Asia and South Asia and the Silk Route that has has been known in the world. And most of these artifacts were sold, a lot of them were destroyed, a lot of them were then sold by the Taliban to dealers and smugglers. They ended up in Pakistan and Iran, and then they went further afield, and there was a huge trade in artifacts, from the Kabul Museum. And of course, Afghanistan, I mean, you described Syria, Hugh. I mean, Afghanistan has seen the destruction of its culture and heritage. And when you look at that, you really see that human beings are going to war against their own history, and that is something really tragic. I mean, whether it's for the sake of religion or ideology, you are denying your own history. You want to smash your own culture that your forefathers built and developed, whether they were Muslim or not Muslim, or they were living 2,000 years ago. And the other factor is what I just want to say, what Vikram is saying, that modernization has not brought about more humaneness in defense of censorship and cultural rights and all the rest of it. In fact, modernization has brought about more destruction. The suicide bomber today is a symbol of modernization. I mean, this is how we go to war today. We go to war by strapping explosives around our bodies. And so we really are in a very, very acute dilemma.
Naman, that brings us back to the point you raised at the start about the lack of demand for preserving and creating this. Why is it, as Ahmed points out, that people generally in this part of the world, don't see this as something that their own ancestors created?
I think if you live in an age when textbooks can be burnt and be prescribed and rewritten to be able to suit certain agendas, and if you live in an age when you're not being able to display things in your museums with the kind of free will where the evidence might be there, and if people aren't given a sense of ownership of their past, if it is separated from them, that it becomes just something that is sitting in that ajaib ghar that is not mine. It sits there, I don't own it. It's not a part of my history anymore. If people aren't allowed to collect artworks and keep them in their homes and have some connection with history and with culture, if it doesn't begin from childhood onward, it's never going to be something that irks you, because you're always separated from the act. You're always separated, you're distanced from it. It's not yours that you're losing.
So are you saying that the idea that these artifacts belong to everyone or belong to the public can actually be a barrier then to creating that sense of connection?
I think there needs to be much more done to be able to inspire people to look at these museums. Museums have a far greater cultural role in society, and I think the education system needs to be able to bring this much more into the curriculum. And I think also galleries and collecting has to become much more endemic, where people have a much closer relationship with their past. A child picking up a little shard as he walks through the ruins of Mohenjo-daro and has a little connection with a piece of pottery that might have been made 2,500 years ago. The museum is stuffed to the gills with shards of pottery from 2500 BC Mohenjo-daro that it doesn't know what to do with and cannot display. If a few people walk off with a few little bits here and there, and it's going to romanticize it and challenge him and make that little kid think about his past and own something that is not necessarily his own cultural history or religious history, well then the artifact has done its job.
Hugh, you mentioned the truck bomb in Cairo that went into the Museum of Islamic Art. Listening to Naman, I'm thinking that the sad end result of all of this could be where things disappear from museums in this part of the world because the British Museum or similar institutions, which are fantastic institutions, have a very compelling argument that we can protect all this cultural heritage in a way that you cannot in its region of origin.
But that would, in a sense, turn our backs on the core of the issue, which is that what is actually happening. And I just wanted to add to Naum's point. I mean, I think that in the particular case of what's happened in a number of Middle Eastern countries, there's this paradox because we have these authoritarian regimes being uprising against them, and then a period of instability in which sometimes the destruction happens after, and as in Egypt, after the regime is gone, and we think, well, we want democracy, but why is it leading to this kind of destruction, if that's how it seems to be? And I think one of the insights is that under many forms of authoritarianism, people are not invested precisely in the way that Nahum was saying, that people, in Iraq, with the fall of Saddam Hussein, I think there was looting of the Iraq Museum, but there was looting of every office in Baghdad. That every arm of the state was considered a target against, it represented everything that people were against at that moment. And so they weren't invested, they didn't see, this is our ancient heritage, this is Babylon. They saw it as, this is the old regime.
And also people are poor.
Yes.
Extremely, and
they have concerns which override questions of culture or heritage, quite apart from the fact that they don't see it as ours. They see it as, it was the Buddhist idol worshipper or something like that, or it was the Hindu. They don't see it as their own. But secondly, it's very difficult now for people to think, that there are matters beyond making sure their kids are fed.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why I think it's a disaster, but I don't see what the optimistic or what even the practical way out is. So it's really quite interesting to see what we think about that.
Because you touched on this, Hugh, when you said how difficult it is to raise awareness about what's happening in Syria on the cultural side, in the midst of such terrible human suffering, that it seems wrong, doesn't it, to even talk about those incredible centers of historical excellence which are being destroyed. It can be a difficult argument to make.
It's a difficult argument to make, and yet it goes hand in hand with the discussion right now happening this week of creating humanitarian space, creating humanitarian access, zones of safety for people, but also zones of safety for culture. There should be, there should be a way to at least protect. I mean, there is a recognition, even on the part of most players in the conflict, that they're not essentially, so many of these incidents have happened in the crossfire, that the war has become a kind of total war, and there's been no humanitarian space. And no humanitarian space has meant no cultural space.
I just want to go back for a moment and refer to the comments that the ambassador made, because you mentioned, Hugh, the looting in Iraq, and obviously that happened under the noses of the world's most powerful military. And Ahmed, I just wonder, the work that is being done now, whether it's in Lahore, elsewhere in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, is that an acknowledgement of mistakes that have been made in places like Iraq? What wasn't done there?
Well, yes, in a way it is, but unfortunately, I would say the situation, whether it's Pakistan or Afghanistan, is the lack of government support and the lack of government initiative in making the public conscious and aware of these issues. After all, our textbooks still teach us, to actually look down upon the civilization of Mohenjo-daro or Harappa or when Buddhism was predominant here. We're still teaching children the wrong kind of history. We're not teaching children the true heritage, which goes back thousands of years and was one of the earliest civilizations in the world. So, I feel until governments take a hand, society, I agree, people's attitudes have to be changed, but governments also have a huge responsibility in changing the direction of the way people think. And unless this is sustained in a certain way, the human rights abuses today in Pakistan, every day you hear about honor killings, about the rape of women, about the disappeared in Baluchistan, the killings in Karachi and people ending up in gunny bags, chopped up into pieces. The reaction of the government at the real human rights level, trying to educate people about this, is almost zero. And we really need to address this issue.
There's some people, I certainly do not agree with this point of view, who say that, well, this is our culture. There is this dreadful argument, you can call it dreadful, but people say the Kap Panchayat, for example, which supports the honor killing, or you can call this Pakhtunwali, whatever you want to call it. You then say, this is our culture, and we want to preserve this. Do you think, and do we all think, of course, there's something that trumps this idea of culture? In other words, an idea of humanity, insaniyat, equality.
Look, I mean, everything in our, everything in our humaneness, everything in our religion teaches us to be tolerant and teaches us to respect other people's religions, other people's points of view. This is our religion is not a religion of mass slaughter and slitting of people's throats and devising new and more horrible ways of killing as many people as possible through things like suicide bombing and mine warfare. Our religion teaches us something else, and so does our humanity, and so does our history. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was not a bloodthirsty man. History obviously may dispute this, but we did not go to war to make Pakistan. We won it constitutionally through parliaments and through a campaign and through a movement. That legacy surely has to be part of our history and legacy.
Naman, just give us a perspective across the border where there have been, a whole series of documented challenges to freedom of expression. Is there any kind of government response that is positive or that gives you hope, or is it just a question of it's much easier to let these kind of concerted, destructive campaigns run their course and, hope it then goes away, at least until the next one?
Well, I think there have been sort of such a variety of responses. Sometimes you find that the responses on the part of government have been exemplary and really have been quite fantastic. There have been other times when the government hasn't even been given a chance to respond, and something has been, there's a perceived threat, as we've just encountered. And there have been some cases where you see that they are sort of hiding behind certain extreme pressures which are being levied upon them, which are the kind of things that we are interested in talking about at the moment. And what makes government so weak that they capitulate so easily to that kind of perceived threat? And why is it not able to be larger than that perceived threat? And how is it that, this is what I was saying, we all live just a hair's breadth away, and the encroachment on our individual spaces is such a pernicious thing that it happens every day. And every time you let it slip, and you let it go, there's a little bit more encroachment on ourselves, that we are allowing it to come closer and closer to allowing it to be that way, to let that be the norm. And the more we are going to actually state our case to be able to fight against it, the larger our chances to be able to defend our space for any kind of exchange.
I don't think we can just allow it to run its course. We've got to do something.
We've got to do something.
But there are no votes, are there, really, in standing up for culture? It doesn't feel that way at the moment.
There may be. There may be. I mean, I think people do admire people who speak sincerely and who talk with some courage about various things that need to be talked about. And it is possible, for example, that if not in the short run, at least in the medium run, that if enough people as individuals or as collected groups of individuals do speak up on various subjects, it could affect power at various levels. It could affect power at the direct voter level, possibly, especially in situations where the first past the post system, a couple of percentage points of difference could make could make the difference. Or it could affect people at the legislative level, coalitions of parties that could get together to pass a bill or to ratify an ordinance. Or it could work at the judicial level to influence not to directly influence the judges, but to influence the climate in which they operate. So I don't see it as being entirely impossible. After all, votes are not just the votes of the electorate, they're also votes in Parliament, and they're also votes which might lead to a 5-4 or a 6-3 or a 3-2 judgment in a court.
Okay. Hugh, did you want to add anything before?
Oh, yeah, I just, your earlier point about what has happened since Iraq, I did want to mention that from the American point of view, the U.S. Government has developed a quite broad cultural initiative within its military, and I actually know a number of archaeologists who have worked in this program, and they train, they give the soldiers cultural heritage training before they're deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq, and this happened during the Iraq War. This was developed, and so this was a response that yes, we need to be doing more. And it's interesting in the sense it's going back to this monuments men of
exactly.
It's a new generation of monuments men.
A new generation, and creating that and fostering that. I mean, I was recently asked to come and speak at the Indian Military Academy in the same way, to start training the gentlemen cadets in art history and exposing them to the wealth that they control in the sites that they are at, and at border zones particularly. And, you know, making efforts like that is going to be important, and I think it's about making a change in the system where major organizations like the military, like if we can make a change in the UPSC or the CSS civil service entrance exams in this country, where art history and archaeology and cultural history actually become subjects that civil servants are meant to be educated in, to be able to sensitize them.
Out of interest, what was the response like?
Right at the outset, then you have an opportunity for a systemic change of people in the cadres of the civil service who are sensitive to matters of culture, when it isn't looked upon as the most useless posting that can be given as a punishment to a civil servant to make him in charge of archaeology, but actually to exonerate that position.
I don't know.
The old gazetteers that we read, you know, the old civil service gazetteers, show the enthusiasm that people who are posted in a particular district had for the artifacts, the ways of life, the archaeological heritage of that area. That's one point I want to make about I think that these institutions, for example, the question of the destruction of the Baghdad Museum or the plundering of it, if I read the ambassador right, he said we've got a slightly mixed record. Well, of course, I don't know if it's a canard or not, but it was thought that one or two ministries were protected, but that the museum was not. And I think that there's an aspect, perhaps, of making amends that is taking place, which is a very good thing in a sense, a recognition that destruction did happen. But I don't think we should then try to vilify the institution which either through lack of foresight, it certainly wasn't deliberate, but it was certainly lack of foresight, allowed something like that to happen. Similarly, I would say at a smaller level, an institution like Penguin. Now, they may have made a very, very wrong decision. And I think the decision was made in India. It was not foisted upon them from abroad. Sadly, this is what I believe happened. But I think, from my conversations, again, not to defend the decision at all, I think what they're trying to do is to make some kind of, now amends, in what sense? To try to get together a coalition of publishers so that they're not just publishers, but maybe people in the wider world of art and culture, so that in each particular case, they're not alone. They don't feel beleaguered. Well, Macmillan gave in with Shivaji, so well, maybe we should throw in the towel with this one. But secondly, also maybe to get, a slate of lawyers, of legal advisors together, so that if anything like this happens, you can stem it at the beginning. So I do think that institutions, whether it's the US government or a publishing firm or whoever it might be, can also be seen, partly as a result of past actions, to not be neutral in this battle, but actually to be possible and indeed fairly effective allies.
Yes. Thank you. Could we bring the lights up, because so that we can get questions? Could you raise your hand if you've got a question, and we'll get microphones round the room to you. Okay, thank you. I don't know, how far up do we have microphones? Because I can see lots of hands up here. We'll try and get some microphones to that side of the room. Okay, let's go here first. Go ahead.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion, but I have a slight sort of concern, because you've been talking about buildings and artifacts and education, all very important issues, but what about the lived everyday life of culture in a society? Things like dress and fashion and music and so on. And another thing that I want to say is that the Taliban are our children. So what were we as a collective society in Pakistan and a collective humanity, what responsibility were we taking, and what responsibility are we taking for them? Okay, they're slitting throats, but why are they slitting throats? They were not slitting throats 35 years ago. So why is it that we're here today? And what is it that we can do to affect a change at the everyday level? And that's what I'd like to talk
Thank you.
about.
And you're right, we haven't raised theatre or public spaces like this. Why aren't they used more all the time for public performance? But Ahmed, I think that question is right up your street.
No, I agree with you completely, and I think, again, I blame governments primarily for failing to raise people's consciousness about this fact, and the fact that, policy has been made in Pakistan for decades in a completely opaque and untransparent way. We have no idea how policy decisions are being made and what issues policy makers, come up with in their meetings. And consequently, a great deal of policies that have been made, foreign policies about Pakistan, have been made really against the people of Pakistan, in my opinion. And unless this changes, and this can only change when we have a proper parliamentary system, a democracy, not one, again, where a democracy where 5 or 6 people make decisions in a completely untransparent way, but a democracy in which policies are actually discussed and debated by an alert public and media. This is not happening, unfortunately, in Pakistan. We've had 2 successive governments now. They both acted in exactly the same way, which is to keep everything, under tight control, not let anyone know. I mean, we were apparently going into FATA, into North Waziristan on January the 29th. The ruling party was briefing everyone about that, and within minutes after the speech, the Prime Minister decided to do a U-turn. Now, we're all left wondering, what happened? I mean, what made you do this U-turn? Is there any can you give us an explanation, please? We're still waiting. And it's, nearly the end of February.
Naman?
Thank you so much for raising that, because I think it comes down to culture in the everyday. It comes down to the fundamental thing about how you're preserving the folklore, the theatre, the music that might be in people's hearts latent somewhere, and what are we going to do to be able to re-evoke that, if that is going to be the instrument of maintaining some semblance of sanity and temperance, then what can we do to be able to sustain that in people? And I think one of the biggest instrument of our times is the electronic media. And I will turn this question around to the most visible form of the electronic media today and ask them this question. And say, how much are you being able to do to be able to give my community what I have been brought up on, rather than giving me a certain kind of anodyne culture which is foisted down our throats on the electronic media particularly, which we may not have any interest in, or may not actually come down to those kinds of local concerns. And if the spirit and the message of those narratives and those stories has to be kept alive, I think it is very important to be able to find new kinds of mediums to be able to communicate those messages and keep them alive. But by pulping textbooks and by rewriting textbooks, or whatever we are doing, I don't think we are allowing the media the kind of freedom, and nor do I think that is the media owning up to its full responsibility in being able to cater to the vernacular what it needs to.
Yeah. could we go to the lady here? And sorry, just one second. And could we get another microphone towards the back of the room? There's a gentleman in a white jacket. Sorry, someone with a microphone's going to have to run up those stairs. Thank you. In the meantime,
I wanted to ask a question. So there's been this discussion about how religious extremism and these sorts of forces are really, destroying sites of culture. They're stopping the space for this kind of activity. But I wanted to bring this attention to sort of other superpowers in the world who are supposedly secular, who are, these hotbeds of civilization. And when they go into countries with as old civilizations as Mesopotamia and destroy forces, how can they sort of now come up and say that we are doing amends? I mean, what is the responsibility of these people?
Okay, can we give a microphone? Could we give a microphone to the ambassador, actually, if you could respond to that? No, because there is really valuable work that's being done right here on our doorstep in Lahore. Ambassador, just here. Sorry, come back. The ambassador sitting here.
The man with the red socks.
Yes, red socks. I didn't want to say, but thank you. You're right.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure which superpower you were referring to. Look, I mean, it would be tedious for us to re-adjudicate the question of, say, Iraq War. The position of the administration that I represent is certainly that many mistakes were made and that there were indeed calamitous consequences which continue to reverberate through the Middle East for some of the decisions that were made, and indeed continue to reverberate through this part of the region, in this region. But I think the point is that we have learned from the experience that we went through, particularly in Iraq, and have tried very hard to work, particularly in the area of cultural preservation, to save, what is a heritage of mankind. Having made mistakes and having recognized that particularly in 2003. And as I said in my opening remarks, we do have an extensive program for cultural preservation around the world. Lahore has been a beneficiary of that, and indeed we have 17 projects ongoing in Pakistan. So I would say our record is imperfect, but at the same time we are working towards, I think, objectives that are probably shared by most on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Okay, yes, question up there, and then I'd like to come there have been many hands up, but if we could come to one of the people who have their hands up here. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'd like to ask how important is the role of number one, education, and number two, economic prosperity in preserving and promoting culture? Thank you.
Thank you. Education and economic prosperity. Vikram, and then I'll come to you, Hugh.
I've spoken a little about that, so I'll just pass it on to someone with other insights. I have spoken a little about it. So
okay, economic prosperity, Hugh.
I'm more interested in hearing what you have to say.
Is the preservation only possible when it's done by the society itself at a point of a certain amount of prosperity? I mean, one doesn't know when it'll be possible to work on the areas that you've brought up in Syria, for example.
No, but I think, to be fair, we should also say that in Egypt, where I've described some of these events, there have been heroic efforts by just grassroots people coming up from the streets. I think in 2011, people held hands to protect the library in Alexandria from attack. Yes. And the attack I mentioned at the Museum of Islamic Art, there are people who spent, 3 days straight just picking through the rubble and putting things back together. The Institut d'Egypte was also attacked in 2011. Similarly, there's been a heroic effort. And I think even in Syria, there are Syrian museum directors who have done with almost no resources, done their best to protect. So there, in every one of these cases, no matter how bad it is, there are people who are passionate about protecting their culture, and I think it's just a question of how do we help these people and enable them.
But the economics aspect?
What was
It has to be simultaneous. I mean, it's got to be economic.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be at a point of economic prosperity. It can happen at any time.
You know, the heroic efforts of the men of the Kabul Museum, for instance, which was celebrated in the National Geographic exhibition that went all across the world, I think that is a really valiant story that really needs to be told again and again. Kabul's own monuments men that protected their museum's treasures and then had them available for the world to see. And I think their empathy, coming back to the question that was raised earlier, of having worked in that museum even without salaries for so many years, and yet being there to protect the very artifacts that they developed a relationship with. I think that's the kind of story that we need to hear more of. But indeed, education and money do go together, and we do need to, that's why we're having a discussion in this kind of a gathering, but we're also talking about a discussion that can be happening in a very different demographic.
Speaking of the heroism of the museums, Ahmed, am I right in thinking that in Swat also, they either they protected some, I think they moved some away, and Kamla Shamsi was talking in this hall earlier today about the incredible treasures of the Peshawar Museum. So, these precious things are being protected in their area of origin right now.
Yes, there are, and I think this argument of economic prosperity. Look, poor people do not destroy culture. Unless they are radicalized or influenced by some ideology. Poverty does not mean that you're ignorant of your heritage or your humaneness or your religion. In fact, a lot of poor people are probably much more humane and religious and aware of things around them than we are. So I don't think it's just a question of economics. I think it's really the question of what the state is selling the public, what the state is telling the public.
Yes, I'm Nasir, and I'm from FATA Bajo Agency, right? My question is from Mr. Ahmed Rashid. Talibans are the sons of an ideology, right? Whether wrong or right, but they are the sons of an ideology. The United States, Pakistan, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia are the creators of that ideology, right? So,
your question?
So my question is, as Mr. Rashid said that Taliban are a handful of people, right? The question is how to deal with that handful of people, right? Should we kill that handful of people or the ideology, right? If we choose to kill the ideology, how? What can be the possible repercussions of that? I want the answer from Mr. Rashid and Mr. President. Thank you.
Okay, I think you might have to settle just for Ahmed Rashid on that point.
Look, I think one of the problems that we have had as a nation over many, many years has been our failure to take responsibility for our own mistakes. And yes, certainly, all these neighboring countries did have a role. But who allowed them? Why did we allow them to have a role in helping fund, whether it was the Taliban in Afghanistan or in Pakistan or whatever? The question is, unless you take responsibility for your own country, for yourself, we're not going to move forward at all. We're going to be immersed in this blame game forever. Okay. So I'm not going into, we have a very long and tragic history of supporting extremism. We supported extremist groups fighting in Kashmir, in India, in Afghanistan, in Central Asia. We have done that physically. We have supported such groups for many, many years. Maybe we're not doing that now. I hope we're not. And certainly at various stages, countries have helped us in that, because it helped the Saudis at one point, because they were riled up against Iran, so they wanted us to support terrorist activities in Iran. So other countries have got involved. But I think the first and primary importance is to take responsibility for your own actions.
Hello?
Thank you. Sorry, sir, I'm going to ask you to stop because we have very limited time and I need to get a few more questions. Thank you very much. Can we turn to the lady who's been waiting here?
Yeah, my name is Najibullah Kakar from Balochistan.
Sorry. Hang on. I don't know where you are, but I'm hoping to go to a lady here. Could you just wait, please?
I'm Najibullah Kakar from Balochistan.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Could you wait, please? Could we give a microphone to the lady here who's been waiting in the red dupatta, please? Thank you.
Hello. I'd like to actually widen the concept of terrorism, because from what I see, I myself and I think my children and all of us are also suffering from a wider range of terrorism as is usually defined. What about the terrorism of globalization, the terrorism of materialism, terrorism of consumerism, terrorism of the concept of development which only equates development to economy? And what about going back to seeing how each of us actually do come from a tradition, and most of us, whichever part of the world we come from, whether the Western world or the Eastern world, we do come from traditional societies that lived with the concept of the sacred. What about talking about and not being afraid of taking the bull by the horns, the ideology that is talked about by the Taliban? We need to be strong in our identity of our own sacred ideology, and only when our sacred ideology goes ahead will we be able to find any peace in the world. Thank you.
Could you give the microphone to the gentleman there? Let's get a couple more thoughts before we come back to the panel. Yes.
I'm Najibullah Kakar from Balochistan.
We know.
Yeah.
We know.
Thank you, Farid. Yeah. First, my comment is regarding the literary festival, that why this festival is epicenter and control to Lahore and Karachi, why the people of KPK or Balochistan are not inviting to this literary festival.
Okay. Thank you.
My question is from Mr. Ahmed Rashid, that
Okay, if you could be brief.
Afghani people blame Pakistan or its neighbor countries for the Biaman incident and the Kabul Museum. Most of the asset of Kabul Museum is lying in the ex-former minister of Nasirullah Babar in the PPP government. Is his own museum. Why we have stolen the assets of these people? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you, who's got the other microphones at the moment? Let's get another couple of thoughts here. Someone with the microphone here? Yes.
Yes. I am from South Waziristan, Wana. My question is, as we are talking about culture and the war on culture, so my question is that I have a friend which was studying, which was preparing himself for the higher school exam, and he was struck hit by the drone attack. And at the same time, we are children in Balochistan who are missing their fathers, their brothers and their uncles. So I did think so that the countries and states, they have more role to preserve culture and to stop these things affecting the culture. We can do a small portion of this. The major forces that have to play their role are the governments, as that is of Pakistan or US or whatever.
Thank you.
I did think so.
Thank you very much. In our final moments, I'm going to come back to the panel, but I also want to ask if there are ever any examples of, we've heard so much about the pressures that are going against the flourishing of culture, and yet here we are, in Lahore, in this fantastic setting with so many people able to talk about their artistic creations and their work and to do so freely. And I just wonder about the avenues that do remain open for the flourishing of culture, even in the toughest circumstances. You know, the way that there has been a flourishing of the art scene in this country, for example, in recent years, against the odds. I think we just literally have a few more minutes, so just some final thoughts perhaps from everyone on the panel.
Well, I think one thing which is absolutely stunning is that when there is preservation of buildings, monuments, communities, localities, the local people get involved immediately. We've seen that in Lahore, we've seen that in Kabul. Right now there's a huge preservation work going on about the old city in Kabul, trying to restore it. The local people love it and get involved immediately. There is no sense of them saying, no, we want, you know, blocks of modern flats instead of our old houses and buildings being restored. So I think that is something that we should build on.
Hugh?
Well, to go to the globalization point, I think there's a positive dimension to this, precisely in that when you preserve culture, it is an economic good as well, and it brings people in. This is precisely the kind of event that we should have more people coming from more countries coming to Lahore, coming to see. It's a beautiful city, and I've been to panels today where Kamila Shamsi mentioned the beautiful museum in Peshawar. No one thinks of Peshawar as having a beautiful museum in our country because all we hear is bad news about Peshawar, but in fact there are beautiful cultural sites all over Pakistan, and when you unlock the possibility of culture, it can become a huge economic good as well as a way of having people invest in their own heritage, and it can be very positive.
Naman.
Well, I've been trying to say this, I think, all afternoon, and trying to raise examples about stories that can be used as which can be exemplary stories, and the Kabul Museum is certainly one of them. But I also think that we need to mount enough pressure on our law courts and put them in the block, as it were, because put them in the spot, let them try and make that judgment which is going against the grain, and if you feel adequately against it, speak out, because that is the right forum and the only forum which you can keep fighting within to be able to have yourself heard. And it is contingent upon us to not stay quiet at that space, in that space. And so I think there are many stories of successes, but I think I'd like to end by talking about what is our responsibility to protect those spaces. And
Vikram.
Well, I don't have very much more to add to what's been said. I think that no one knows, as I said, in this matter of rates, which one is going to win through and to what effect. Let us hope that action at the individual level and the group level works one way or another. Culture is a great good, quite apart from economics. It is an intrinsic good in its own right. But if there is a conflict, and there are occasions where there are conflicts between so-called culture and humanity, I would hope that humanity would trump so-called culture.
Thank you. Just before I hand over to Ahmed for the closing words of today, I'd just like to say again how fantastic it is that we are all here today, and I really look forward to the day where we do have a Quetta Literature Festival and a Peshawar Literature Festival, and so many other troubled areas. So, and in the meantime, I'd like to thank everyone who's worked so hard to make this Literature Festival possible, and may your efforts be rewarded and flourish in the future as well. Thank you, and I'm going to ask Ahmed, who's been such a driving force for this event, to bring everything to a close.
I just want to very quickly honor three sets of people. The first is a woman who has become the face of Pakistan globally, the best known face around the world, and that is Mishal Husain. She is the face of Pakistan. Today she's on BBC World Service, she's on BBC Radio World Service, she's on domestic British TV, and she's on domestic radio. There's no other Pakistani in the media who has been able to generate so much positive goodwill for Pakistan, and we honor you for that. The second, I think, we owe an immense gratitude to the teams of people who've been working behind the scenes for this festival. The cleaners, the lighting operators, the student volunteers who've been here day and night, and I could name many, many more. But they've done a sterling, absolutely wonderful job to bring this festival to completion. Lastly, the real heroes of this festival, the real stars of this festival have been you, have been the audience. Without your enthusiasm and without your love and your affection and your desire to be here at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, I mean, we really could not have been so inspired to do what we've done. And we have been so